The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day the electricity was cut off. Nora Calloway had been expecting one of those things. Not both at once, and certainly not on the same afternoon that her daughter came home from school with a permission slip for a field trip that cost $40 she did not have. The permission slip was pink, cheerful, printed in a font that did not understand what $40 meant to a woman who had been sorting her pantry by expiration date for the better part of 3 months. She set it on the counter beside the unopened mail and stood in her kitchen in the early dark of a November afternoon, listening to the refrigerator hum its last few notes before it went quiet, too. She was 34 years old. She had a 7-year-old daughter named Macy, and a car with a cracked windshield held together by 2 strips of packing tape, and a rented house in the lower part of Aldine County where the roads turned to gravel 2 blocks before her driveway. She had a job at the county records office, processing property transfers and deed changes, work she was good at, work that paid just enough to keep her from sliding entirely off the edge, and not quite enough to ever feel safe. She had been doing this balancing act for 2 years, ever since the divorce, ever since the version of her life she thought she was building turned out to be something her ex-husband had simply borrowed and then returned in poor condition. She was not a woman who complained. That was the part people closest to her would tell you first, and then immediately follow with the kind of observation that sounds like a compliment but is actually a concern. She just keeps going, they would say. She never asks for help, they would add, their voices carrying that particular mix of admiration and worry that falls just short of actually doing anything useful. So when the electricity cut off that Tuesday and Nora stood in her darkening kitchen with a pink permission slip and a stack of envelopes she had been avoiding, she did the thing she always did. She lit a candle she found under the sink, sat down at the table, and opened the mail. Most of it was expected. A notice from the utility company, a bill from the pediatrician, a coupon circular from a grocery store she rarely shopped at because it was on the far side of town, and then, at the bottom of the stack, out an envelope she did not recognize. Plain white, the return address bearing the name of a law office she had never heard of, located in a small town called Cressfield, almost 2 hours north. She opened it without thinking too hard about it, the way you open things when you are already tired and one more surprise seems manageable simply because you are too exhausted to be afraid of it. The letter inside was 3 pages long. It was formal, dense with legal language, and it took her 2 full readings under the candle to understand what it was actually saying. When she did understand, she sat very still for a moment, the paper resting in both hands, and read the central part of it a 3rd time, just to be certain. Her great-uncle, Roland Voss, had died 6 weeks earlier. She had not known Roland Voss well. She had met him twice in her life, both times at family gatherings when she was young, and remembered him only as a tall man with a deliberate way of speaking, someone who asked questions and then waited for the full answer before responding. He had never married, had no children, and had spent most of his adult life working in land, surveying across the northern part of the state. He was, by all accounts, a quiet man who had kept mostly to himself and whose death had been noted by very few people. He had left her a piece of land, not money, not property that could be sold for money in any obvious sense. Land. Specifically a parcel of just over 18 acres located in a section of Aldine County called the Gentry Ravine, a designation that appeared on the deed with the same casual authority as a name given to something considered too inconvenient to develop and too useless to argue over. Nora read the description of the land 3 times. The parcel bordered the ravine on its eastern and southern sides. It was steeply sloped, described in the legal documents as having significant grade changes and rocky substrate conditions. There was no road access except for an unimproved track, classified as seasonal and non-maintained. There was no structure on the land, no water line, no power, no improvements of any kind. The assessed value, printed in plain black type near the bottom of the second page, was $11,000. $11,000 for 18 acres. She stared at that number for a long time. Then she folded the letter, placed it back in the envelope, and put it on the counter beside the pink permission slip. She went and found Macy in her room, where the girl had been doing homework by the light of her battery-powered lantern, unbothered, already adjusted to the current version of things. They ate peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, and Nora told her daughter that the lights would be back on in a day or two, which was a promise she intended to keep, even if she was not entirely certain how. That night, after Macy was asleep, Nora sat in the dark and thought about Roland Voss and his 18 acres of ravine. She thought about what it meant to be left something by someone who barely knew you, whether it was a kindness or an accident of circumstance, some legal default triggered by the absence of anyone closer. And she thought about whether the land was worth the cost of accepting it, because there would be taxes. She knew that much from her job, annual property taxes on land that produced nothing, that sat in a ravine that nobody else had wanted enough to make an offer on. She thought about calling her sister, Dana, who lived in the city and had a husband and a mortgage, and the particular confidence that comes from never having had to count the days until a paycheck. But she knew what Dana would say without asking. Dana had a way of offering advice that felt like a door quietly closing. She would tell Nora to sign the land over to the county or sell it immediately for whatever she could get, or decline the inheritance entirely and save herself the tax burden. And Dana was practical in the way that people are practical when practicality has never cost them anything personally. Nora did not call Dana. Instead, she pulled out her county maps the next morning, the large printed topographic surveys she sometimes used at work, and found the Gentry Ravine section. It was in the eastern part of the county, an area she had processed paperwork for a handful of times over the years, mostly minor things. Road easement disputes, drainage right-of-way adjustments, the occasional boundary correction. The ravine itself was marked with close-set contour lines indicating steep terrain and the thin blue thread of a seasonal creek that ran along its lowest point before disappearing into a culvert somewhere south of the main road. She looked at her great-uncle's parcel on the map for a long time, and the land wrapped around the upper eastern lip of the ravine, dropping sharply toward the creek bed at its lowest edges. It was exactly the kind of land that appeared on surveys as an afterthought, the blank space between things that mattered. She signed the acceptance paperwork and sent it back to the attorney's office in Cressfield. She paid the transfer fee with money she had been setting aside in an envelope marked car repairs. She told herself it was a decision and not a gamble, which was the only way she knew how to move forward with anything. She did not tell her sister for 2 weeks. When she finally did, the response was almost exactly what she had predicted, though delivered with more warmth than precision, which was Dana's way of being kind while still being correct. "A ravine, Nora," Dana said on the phone, her voice carrying that particular patient tone. "You're going to be paying taxes on a hole in the ground." It's 18 acres, Nora said. Of ravine. Of land. 18 acres of land that someone thought was worth leaving to someone. He left it to you because there was no one else and because it wasn't worth the trouble of doing anything else with it. I'm not trying to be harsh. I'm just saying that before you get attached to this, you should understand what it actually is. Nora did not get into an argument. She said she understood, which she did, only not in the way Dana intended. She drove out to see the land on a Saturday in late November, leaving Massey with a neighbor for the afternoon and taking the long route through the county's eastern corridor, where the terrain began to shift from flat agricultural stretches into something rougher and more complex. The land out here had a different quality to it, less managed, more insistent. The trees grew thicker and closer to the road. The hills asserted themselves without apology. She found the parcel by cross-referencing the deed description with her paper county map and the GPS on her phone, which argued with her for the last half-mile before giving up entirely. The unimproved track the legal documents mentioned turned out to be a pair of faint tire ruts running through high grass, barely distinguishable from the field around it except for a slight depression in the ground where vehicles had once passed. And she parked at the edge of the main road and walked in. The land revealed itself gradually, the way all difficult terrain does. What looked flat from a distance began to slope almost immediately. The grass gave way to patchy scrub and then to a tree line thick with second-growth oak and pine. The ground was uneven underfoot, crossed with exposed rock ledges and shallow depressions where water collected during rain. She moved carefully, reading the terrain the way her years of working with survey documents had taught her to, not just seeing what was in front of her, but understanding what the ground was doing beneath the surface. The ravine itself appeared without warning. She came through the trees and the ground simply ended, dropping away in a steep, rocky fall that left her stopping hard at the lip, steadying herself with one hand against a pine trunk. Below, the creek moved quietly along the ravine floor, dark water between pale stones, catching the thin November light in small, indifferent flashes. She stood there for a long time. The ravine was deeper than she had expected. The walls were mostly rock with thin soil clinging to the upper slopes where roots had managed to find purchase. The far wall rose again in a steep climb to a tree line identical to the one behind her. The floor was narrow, maybe 30 feet across at its widest, pinched to almost nothing in places where the rock walls nearly touched. It was not beautiful in any way that would sell itself to strangers. It was not the kind of place that appeared on postcards or drew weekend visitors from the city. It was austere, indifferent, shaped entirely by water and gravity over a long period of time without regard for how it would be received. She did not find it useless. That was the thing she kept returning to on the drive home, the thing she could not quite explain to herself. She had stood at the edge of her own 18 acres of nothing particularly valuable and had felt something she had not expected, not pride, not excitement, not even hope in any articulate sense. Something quieter, a sense that this land was specific, that it existed in a way that was irreducible, that no matter how little it was worth in the county's assessment, it occupied a particular section of the earth that nothing else occupied. She paid the first property tax installment in January with money she had intended for a new coat. She told herself she would figure out the rest. And the mockery began in February, which was when Dana finally told the rest of the family. Nora had not explicitly asked her to keep it private, which was her own oversight. Dana mentioned it at a birthday dinner for their mother, framing it the way she framed most things, with a surface of concern covering an architecture of judgment. She said she was worried about Nora, that this land decision seemed impulsive, that she hoped Nora wasn't putting herself in a difficult position over something sentimental. Their mother, Patricia, set her fork down and looked at Nora with the expression she reserved for news that required processing before responding. She asked a few careful questions. How much did the property tax run annually? Whether the land was accessible, whether anyone else had wanted it. When Nora answered each one honestly, the silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Their cousin Robert, who sold insurance and had opinions about financial decisions in inverse proportion to his experience with difficult ones, said that he had heard of people inheriting land like that and spending more on taxes over the years than the land was ever worth. He said it with the authority of someone sharing a cautionary tale rather than an observation, which was his standard mode. Nora's ex-husband, when Macy mentioned it during a custody weekend, called Nora to ask if she was all right. He did it with what she recognized as genuine concern filtered through the particular awkwardness of a man who had left and felt vaguely responsible for the consequences of leaving. He asked if she needed help thinking it through. She thanked him and said she had it handled. He said okay in the voice of someone who was not entirely sure she did. At work, her colleague Janet, who processed the same property paperwork in the adjacent department and had an encyclopedic knowledge of what parcels were worth in the county, asked which section it was in when Nora mentioned the inheritance. When Nora told her, Janet made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, but contained most of the same information. "The Gentry Ravine section," Janet said slowly, as though tasting each word. "Honey." "It's 18 acres, Nora said, which was beginning to feel like the only defense she had. "Of that ravine," Janet said. "I processed a deed transfer for a parcel out there maybe 6-7 years ago. The guy bought it for $12,000 thinking he could put in a hunting camp. And then he found out you can't even get a road permit through that terrain without a full geological survey. He tried to sell it for 3 years and eventually donated it to a church just to get off the hook for the taxes." Nora nodded. She said she appreciated the context. She went back to her desk and spent the rest of the afternoon processing property transfers for other people's land that was worth actual money, and tried not to think too hard about what everyone around her had quietly agreed upon, which was that she had inherited a problem and mistaken it for an inheritance. Spring came slow to the eastern part of Aldine County. The frost lingered longer in the ravine sections, held in by the rock walls that blocked the morning sun until well past 9. Nora drove out twice more in April, parking on the road and walking the property line as best she could determine it from the deed description. She brought her county survey maps and her compass and moved through the terrain methodically, not looking for anything in particular, learning the land in the way you learn something that belongs to you before you understand what it is for. On her second April visit, she found the markers. They were not immediately obvious. Survey markers rarely were, especially old ones, especially on parcels that had been largely ignored for decades. But she knew what to look for from years of working with deed records: the iron pins, the concrete monuments, the occasional brass disc set into bedrock for permanence. She found the northeast corner pin easily enough, a rusted iron rod driven into the ground at the top of the ravine lip, its orange survey tape long since rotted away. She found the southeast corner after 20 minutes of searching, lodged between 2 rocks on the upper slope of the ravine wall. It was the western markers that occupied her longer. They ran along what the deed described as the ravine floor, following the creek line at its base. She descended the slope carefully, finding handholds in the rock, moving down into the shadow of the ravine where the air was colder and the sound of the creek replaced the wind from above. Down here, the scale of the terrain was different. The walls rose 40, 50 feet above her. The narrow corridor of sky overhead was pale and remote. The creek moved with a seriousness that seemed outsized for its width, its current strong and deliberate despite the modest flow. But she found the western pin submerged at the creek's edge, its top just visible above the water line. She crouched beside it and examined the surrounding ground, the way the rock walls channeled the water, the way the creek bed had been worn smooth over centuries of flow, the way the geology of the place had created a natural channel of remarkable efficiency. Water moved through this ravine the way it moved through a designed system, directed and purposeful, shaped by forces that had been working longer than anyone had been paying attention. She stood in the creek with her boots getting wet and looked up at the walls and then down at the water, and felt something she could not have put into words precisely, some instinct borrowed from years of reading land documents, an awareness that terrain had functioned beyond its assessed value, and that the relationship between water and stone in a place like this was not accidental. She took photographs on her phone, the walls, the creek, the floor of the ravine at its narrowest and widest points. She photographed the western markers and the water moving past them. She photographed the sky from the ravine floor, that narrow corridor of pale April light. She did not know yet what she had. She did not know what was coming. She was simply paying attention to a piece of land that no one else had found worth paying attention to, doing what her great-uncle Roland had done before her, if the deed records were any indication, holding on to something that the county had long since written off as marginal. Roland Voss had owned the Gentry Ravine parcel for 31 years. She had found this out from the deed history she pulled at work, and a routine search she was qualified to run and which no one would question. He had purchased it in 1991 for $8,000 from a timber company that had stripped the upper slopes and then lost interest in the remainder. He had paid taxes on it every year for 31 years without missing a payment, without making any improvements, without ever filing for any kind of use permit. He had simply owned it, quietly and without apparent purpose, for more than 3 decades. She had pulled his tax records, too, which were public. He had paid the minimum consistently without complaint. There was no correspondence in the file, no appeals, no adjustments requested, just payment year after year for a piece of land in a ravine that nobody wanted. She wondered what he had known, whether he had stood where she stood, and at the bottom of the ravine, with the creek moving past his boots, and seen something that the official documents did not record. Whether his years of land surveying had given him the same instinct she felt now, formless and difficult to justify, that this particular piece of ground had a specificity to it that assessment values could not capture. Or perhaps he had simply held on to it out of stubbornness. Perhaps he had bought it for reasons now lost, the way land is sometimes acquired, and then held it because letting it go felt worse than paying the taxes. That was possible, too. Land had a way of becoming personal without your permission. Summer arrived, and with it a hardship she had not anticipated. Her position at the county records office was restructured in June, which was the bureaucratic way of saying that 3 positions were eliminated, and hers was one of them. She received a severance package of 4 weeks' pay and a letter expressing gratitude for her service. She spent the first week applying for jobs. She spent the second week applying for more. She arranged her bills in order of urgency on the kitchen table and did the arithmetic that she already knew the answer to, working it out on paper anyway because seeing the numbers clearly felt better than leaving them as abstractions. Macy started asking questions in the careful way children ask questions when they sense that honest answers might be hard for the adult to give. She asked whether they were going to move. She asked whether she would have to change schools. She asked these things at bedtime, not in the particular silence that settles around children who are worried when the worry has nowhere else to go. Nora answered each question with as much truth as she could measure. Not right now. I'm working on it. We're going to be okay. She believed the last part. She believed it because she had no other available option, and because Macy needed her to, which had always been enough. Her sister called in July with an offer delivered in the language of practical concern. Dana and her husband could cover Nora's rent for 2 months, she said. It was not a loan, it was a gift, and Nora could pay it back whenever and if whenever came. There was a long pause on Nora's end of the line while she processed the simultaneous gratitude and grief of needing someone's help and knowing they were right to offer it. She accepted. She thanked Dana with a sincerity that surprised them both, and did not bring up the ravine land, which she knew would form the unspoken subtext of the conversation. She knew Dana was thinking it. The taxes on that ravine parcel were coming due in October, and Dana knew the numbers well enough to be doing the calculation. But Dana did not say it, and Nora appreciated that restraint more than she could express. She found a part-time job in August, processing contracts for a small land development firm in town. It was not the same as her county position, it paid less and offered no benefits, but it was work she understood, and it put her back in contact with the current activity of the county's land market, which was something she found herself paying closer attention to now than she ever had before. The county had been growing steadily, not dramatically, but with the kind of consistent pressure that accumulates over years and eventually demands response. The eastern sections had been slower to develop than the western and northern parts, held back by their terrain and limited infrastructure. But there were conversations happening she was beginning to notice, quiet conversations conducted in the language of planning documents and commission agendas, about what the county's growth would require over the next decade and how the infrastructure to support it would be built. Water was always the center of those conversations. It was always water in county planning, in regional development strategy, in the careful arithmetic of population growth and resource capacity. Where water came from, where it went, how much there was, and how to have more of it when more was needed. These were the permanent questions that underlay everything else. She heard the word reservoir mentioned for the first time at a planning commission meeting she attended in September, not because she was required to be there, but because she had developed the habit of reading the public meeting agendas and occasionally sitting in on the sessions that seemed relevant to her work. The mention was brief, almost offhand. A commissioner referring to a regional infrastructure study that was currently underway and whose preliminary findings would be presented to the full board sometime in the fall. Reservoir siting, he said, was one component of the study. The eastern corridor was being examined as a potential location. Yes, she drove home that evening thinking about the word reservoir and the eastern corridor and the seasonal creek that ran through the floor of the Gentry ravine. Moving with that particular seriousness she had noticed in April, directed and efficient through the narrow channel the rock walls had carved for it over centuries. She did not say anything to anyone. There was nothing to say yet. It was one word at one meeting, a reference to a study that had not been completed. She was a woman who had been mocked gently but consistently for holding on to 18 acres of ravine, and she had learned to hold her thoughts quietly until they had earned the right to be spoken aloud. But that night, after Macy was asleep, she sat at the kitchen table with her topographic maps spread out and traced the creek line through the ravine with her finger, following it from its headwaters north of the county road to where it disappeared into the culvert south of the main corridor. She thought about what a reservoir required in terms of geography: a natural collection point, sufficient watershed, terrain that could be engineered to hold water without prohibitive cost, a location with elevation that allowed gravity-fed distribution. She thought about the ravine walls, 40 feet of solid rock rising on both sides, channeling the flow of the creek into a tight corridor. She thought about what an engineer would see when they looked at that terrain, what they would measure, what they would calculate. She thought about her great-uncle Roland, who had spent his career reading land for a living and had seen something in this particular parcel worth paying taxes on for 31 years. She folded the maps carefully and put them away. She paid the October tax installment with money she had budgeted specifically for that purpose and recorded the payment in the small ledger she kept for the ravine property, a handwritten account of everything the land had cost her so far. The numbers were not large, but they were not small either, measured against what she had. She looked at the total for a moment, the accumulated cost of 18 acres of nothing in particular, and then she closed the ledger and put it on the shelf beside her county survey books. October moved into November, and the quality of light over the eastern county changed the way it always did in that month, flattening and withdrawing, reducing the landscape to its structural elements. The trees lost their cover and the land showed through, the bones of the terrain visible now without the softening of foliage. She drove out to the ravine on the first weekend of November, a year after she had received the letter. She walked the property line again, reading the markers, noting the seasonal changes. The creek was running higher now with the fall rains, its surface rough and insistent. The rock walls were darker with moisture, the stone breathing in the way stone does in wet weather, exhaling a cold mineral smell that belonged entirely to this place and nowhere else. She stood at the bottom of the ravine for a long time, listening to the water. She was thinking about Roland Voss, about what he had known and when he had known it, about whether a man who spent 30 years paying taxes on land assessed at $11,000 had known something the assessors had not, or whether he had simply been a stubborn old man who refused to let a piece of ground go because letting it go was a kind of defeat. She thought about the difference between those two things and whether it mattered which was true. The creek moved past her boots and continued south, following its ancient course, indifferent to her questions. The rock walls held their position. The narrow sky above was the particular gray of a November afternoon in the eastern hills, flat and even and without drama. She took one photograph before she left. Not of anything specific, just the view from the ravine floor looking south, the creek and the rock walls and the corridor of gray sky. She put her phone back in her pocket and climbed the slope back to the road. And the regional infrastructure study was presented to the County Board of Commissioners on the 14th of November. She knew the date because she had been watching the agenda. She attended the public session. The room was half full. County staff, a few contractors, a handful of residents who followed planning matters closely. The presentation was thorough, delivered by a team of engineers from a regional firm who moved through their slides with the practiced efficiency of people accustomed to presenting technical material to non-technical audiences. They covered population projections, water demand forecasting, current infrastructure capacity, and future shortfall estimates. When they reached the section on reservoir siting, Nora sat forward slightly in her seat. The engineers presented 3 candidate sites, and the first was in the county's northern section, near an agricultural area where land acquisition would be extensive and disruption to existing operations would be significant. The second was in the west, where terrain was more favorable, but proximity to residential development created both logistical and regulatory complications. The third was in the eastern corridor. The slide for the eastern site showed a topographic map she recognized: the contour lines, the creek line, the narrow corridor of the ravine. The notation on the slide read, "Gentry Ravine Formation," and the accompanying text described the site's geological characteristics in terms that were the technical language for everything she had observed on her visits: natural channel efficiency, bedrock formation suitable for anchor points, a watershed catchment area consistent with projected storage requirements. The engineer presenting the eastern site spoke with measured enthusiasm, the particular tone of someone who has found what they were looking for, but understands the value of not appearing too eager about it. He described the site as geologically exceptional. He used the word ideal twice before catching himself and substituting favorable the third time. He noted that the eastern corridor site would require land acquisition from several parcel owners in the Gentry Ravine section. He did not list the parcel numbers. Nora did not need him to. She drove home through the dark of a November night, the heater in her car working badly as it always did in cold weather, out the cracked windshield catching the headlights of oncoming vehicles and scattering them in small arcs across her field of vision. She drove carefully and did not turn on the radio. She thought about the word acquisition. She thought about what the county paid for land it needed for infrastructure projects. She thought about the 18 acres that wrapped along the eastern and southern sides of the ravine, the parcel that sat directly in the path of the most favorable reservoir site in the county's entire eastern corridor. She thought about $11,000 and what it meant as an assessed value when the county needed land badly enough to call it geologically exceptional. She did not let herself think too fast. She had been here before, in the vicinity of something that looked like a change in fortune, and she had learned that the distance between proximity and arrival was where most hope ran out of road. She was careful with hope in the way you are careful with things that have been scarce. But she thought about Roland Voss and his 31 years of quiet patience, paying taxes on a piece of ground while the county grew slowly toward it, and she thought that maybe stubbornness and foresight were not as different from each other as they appeared. She pulled into her driveway and sat for a moment before going inside. The night was cold and clear, the kind of November night that made the stars look closer than they were. She looked at them for a moment through the cracked windshield, then gathered her bag and went in to check on her daughter. Macy was asleep, and sprawled diagonally across her bed the way children sleep when they have no anxiety about taking up space. Nora stood in the doorway for a moment, watching the rise and fall of her daughter's breathing, and felt the particular love that lives at the edge of fear, the love that exists most clearly in the moments when you understand exactly how much you have to lose. She went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea, and sat down at the table with her county survey maps. She spread out the topographic sheet for the eastern corridor and placed her finger on the Gentry Ravine section. She traced the parcel boundary with the tip of her nail. The 18 acres that wrapped along the upper ravine. The 18 acres that sat in the precise location the engineers had identified as geologically exceptional, and the 18 acres that no one had wanted except Roland Voss, and then, by inheritance and stubbornness, and a refusal to let go of something simply because everyone agreed it was worthless, Nora Calloway. She did not know yet how large it would become. She did not know the number the county would eventually put on the table. She did not know the fight that was coming, the complications, the things she would have to understand and navigate and endure before the story reached its resolution. She did not know that the land her great-uncle had left her would require her to become someone she had not yet been required to be. She only knew what she had known from the beginning, since the night she sat by candlelight in a dark kitchen and read 3 pages of legal language by the light of a candle she had found under the sink. She had known then that the land was real, that it existed in a specific way that nothing could unmake, and that specific existence was worth something that the assessed value did not begin to measure. She folded the maps. She washed her cup. She turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark of her house, listening to the silence of a November night in the lower part of Aldine County, where the roads turned to gravel 2 blocks before her driveway. Then she went to bed, and for the first time in a long time, she slept without difficulty. The county's first contact came 14 days after the infrastructure presentation, which told her something important before anything else was said. 14 days was fast. In county government, 14 days was practically urgent, the bureaucratic equivalent of running. And she knew the rhythms of that system well enough from her years at the records office to understand that when it moved quickly, it was because something was moving it. Some pressure applied from above or from outside that compressed the usual timetable. Committees moved slowly. Individual commissioners moved slowly. Projects moved slowly. But need, real infrastructural need, backed by population data and engineering reports and the political weight of a county that was outgrowing its water capacity, that moved at its own speed. The call came on a Wednesday morning while she was at her desk at the land development firm, processing easement documents for a subdivision project in the county's western corridor. The number on her phone was a county exchange, which she recognized immediately. She let it ring twice before answering. Not from hesitation, but from the instinct that the first impression you make in a negotiation is established before the first word is spoken. The man who called identified himself as Gerald Pruitt, Assistant Director of the county's Infrastructure Development Office. His voice was professional and unhurried, the voice of a man who made this kind of call regularly and understood that the first conversation set the temperature for everything that followed. He said he was reaching out to property owners in the Gentry Ravine section in connection with the reservoir infrastructure project and asked whether she had seen the public presentation from the previous month. She said she had. He said the county was in the early stages of a land acquisition process and was contacting parcel owners to initiate preliminary conversations. He used the word preliminary twice in the first 2 minutes, which was its own kind of information. He asked whether she would be available for a meeting at the county offices to discuss her parcel and the county's interest in it. She said she could be available the following week. He said that would be fine and thanked her for her time with the warmth of someone who expected the conversation to be simple. She spent the next 5 days doing research of a kind she had never done before, but felt instinctively equipped for, drawing on everything her years at the records office had built into her understanding of how land and government intersected. She pulled every public document related to the reservoir project that had been filed with the county. She read the engineering study in full, not just the summary slides from the presentation, but the complete technical report that ran to 214 pages and was available for public review at the county clerk's office. She requested a copy and read it over 3 evenings, making notes in the margins of a legal pad, translating the technical language into the plain terms she needed to understand what the engineers were actually saying. What they were saying, in the language beneath the language, was this: the Gentry Ravine site was not merely favorable, it was the project. The northern site, upon full geological assessment, had complications in its subsurface that would require extensive remediation before construction could begin. The engineers had quantified the additional cost at somewhere between $4 and $7 million, with a significant uncertainty range that made it difficult to commit to a firm budget. The western site had a regulatory problem involving a protected wetland designation on a portion of the required acquisition area, which meant an environmental review process that could add 2 to 3 years to the timeline. The county board had already signaled, through the careful language of meeting minutes, that timeline delays were politically untenable given the growth projections. The eastern site, the Gentry Ravine formation, had none of those problems. The bedrock was clean and consistent, ideal for anchor infrastructure. The watershed catchment was substantial and well-defined. The terrain channeled water with what one of the engineers had called natural architectural efficiency, which was the most poetic thing she had ever read in a geological survey. The construction timeline was the shortest of the 3 options by approximately 18 months. The projected total cost was the lowest by a meaningful margin. She read those sections of the report multiple times, then read the land acquisition section, which was briefer and more cautious in its language. The county would need to acquire parcels from several private owners in the eastern ravine corridor. The acquisition process would be conducted in accordance with state eminent domain statutes, which required the county to offer fair market value for any land needed for public infrastructure purposes. Fair market value, the report noted, would be established through independent appraisal. She looked up the state eminent domain statutes that evening on her phone while Macy watched a movie in the living room. She read them carefully, following the specific language around what fair market value meant in the context of infrastructure acquisition and what rights a property owner had in the process, and what happened when a property owner and a county disagreed about what fair market value actually was. The answer to that last question was litigation, which was expensive and slow, but which also meant that the county could not simply take her land at a price it determined unilaterally. It had to offer something defensible, and she had the right to dispute that offer through a process that the county, given its timeline pressure, would be extremely motivated to avoid. She wrote down 2 words in the margin of her legal pad: timeline pressure. She circled them. She called Janet, her former colleague at the records office, not to share what she was thinking, but to ask a question that sounded casual. She asked what the going rate for land acquisitions in the county had been running for infrastructure projects over the past few years. Janet, who knew these things the way she knew the names of every county commissioner, said it varied significantly by location and project type, but that water infrastructure acquisitions had been trending higher because of the complexity of the environmental review requirements and the difficulty of finding suitable sites. She asked, still casually, whether Janet knew of any cases where a single parcel had been particularly critical to a project, where the county had had limited alternatives. Janet paused, It then said there had been one case about 5 years ago, a pipeline corridor project in the northern section where one landowner had held a parcel that sat directly across the only viable route. The county had offered assessed value initially, which the landowner had refused. The final acquisition price had been approximately 8 times the initial assessed value. Nora thanked her and steered the conversation elsewhere. After she hung up, she sat very still at the kitchen table for a moment, doing arithmetic in her head that she had been careful not to do too enthusiastically before she had the facts to support it. 8 times the assessed value. $11,000 assessed value. 8 times 11,000. She stopped herself. Those were someone else's numbers from someone else's situation. She needed to know her own numbers. Yeah, she needed to know what her land was actually worth, not what the county had assessed it at for tax purposes, which was the lowest defensible figure, but what it was worth in the specific context of a reservoir project that had identified the Gentry Ravine Formation as its most viable site, where her parcel sat directly along the eastern and southern boundaries of the acquisition corridor the engineers had mapped. She scheduled an independent land appraisal. The appraiser she found was named Delia Marsh, a licensed real estate appraiser who had been working in the region for 20 years and who came recommended by a real estate attorney whose name she had found through the state bar directory. Delia drove out to the property on a cold Thursday morning in early December, wearing boots appropriate for the terrain and carrying equipment that suggested she took the work seriously. They walked the parcel together, Nora following along with her survey maps, pointing out the marker locations, explaining the deed boundaries, answering questions. Delia was quiet during the walk, which Nora understood as professional attention rather than disengagement. She took measurements, made notes, photographed the terrain features that were relevant to her assessment. At the ravine floor, she spent considerable time examining the creek channel and the rock walls, her expression neutral but focused. She asked several questions about the engineering study, and Nora answered them from memory. When they climbed back out of the ravine, Delia stood at the lip for a moment looking down, and then turned to Nora with an expression that contained something more than professional neutrality. "You've read the full engineering report," Delia said. It was not a question. "Yes," Nora said. "Then you understand what they're saying about this site." "I understand what I understood from reading it. I'm not an engineer." Delia looked back at the ravine. "You don't need to be. The formation here is what they're calling it in the report. That's not a word they use for second-choice sites. That's a word they use when they found what they were looking for." She paused. "The appraisal is going to take me a couple of weeks. There's a methodology for infrastructure-adjacent acquisition that I need to follow carefully, and I want to make sure the documentation is thorough." Nora asked why thorough documentation mattered particularly. Delia looked at her steadily. "Because when the county receives my report, they're going to push back on the valuation. They always do. And when they push back, you want documentation that's bulletproof." Another pause. "Do you have an attorney?" Nora said she was looking into it. Delia said that was a good idea and that she could provide a referral if it would help. Her voice carried the particular tone of someone delivering practical advice without dramatizing it, which Nora appreciated more than she could express. She found an attorney through Delia's referral. His name was Marcus Webb, and he worked out of a small office in the county seat, specializing in land use and property rights. He was in his 50s, compact and precise in his speech, and with the manner of someone who had learned long ago that plain language served his clients better than impressive language. In their first meeting, which lasted 90 minutes, he reviewed everything she had gathered: the deed, the engineering report with her annotations, her notes from the county presentation, the relevant eminent domain statutes she had pulled. He read through it methodically, asking occasional questions, making his own notes. When he finished, he set down his pen and looked at her across the desk. "You've done serious preparation," he said. "I had the information available to me," she said. "I just needed to understand it." "Not everyone does that," he said. "Most people in your position either panic or assume the county will be fair, and panic and assumption lead to the same place." He folded his hands. Here's what I want you to understand. The county has a strong incentive to acquire your parcel, and that incentive increases if the eastern site moves forward as the primary. Your parcel sits on the acquisition corridor in a position that makes it difficult to route around. They're going to come to you with a number that they will describe as fair. That number will be based on assessed value plus a standard multiplier that sounds generous until you understand what the land is actually worth to the project. "What is it actually worth to the project?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "That depends on factors I need time to analyze. The key question is whether there's a viable alternative acquisition route that bypasses your parcel, because if there is, your leverage is limited to fair market value for the land in isolation. If there isn't, your parcel becomes something different. It becomes necessary, and necessary land in a public infrastructure context is priced differently than desirable land." She told him what she had read in the engineering report about the terrain constraints. She described the ravine walls, the creek channel, the way the natural formation limited the viable corridor for anchor infrastructure. She described the parcel boundaries relative to the acquisition zone as she had mapped them from the survey. He listened, then wrote something on his pad. "I need to see the engineering report myself and have someone look at the site before I can give you a real assessment. But what you're describing, if it holds up technically, I suggest your parcel may be in a position that's more valuable than the county will initially acknowledge." The meeting with Gerald Pruitt and 2 colleagues from the infrastructure office happened the following week. She brought Marcus Webb. Pruitt had not expected that. She could see it in the brief recalibration of his expression when they walked into the conference room, the almost imperceptible shift from prepared cordiality to something more careful. He recovered quickly, which told her he was experienced at this, but she had already noted the shift. The county's opening position was delivered with the warmth and confidence of something that had been rehearsed. Pruitt expressed the county's appreciation for her time and cooperation, described the reservoir project's importance to the community, and outlined what he called the county's fair and generous approach to land acquisition. He presented a letter containing the county's initial offer. The number on the letter was $44,000, 4 times assessed value. She had expected something in that range. Marcus had told her to expect something in that range. It was constructed to sound substantial relative to what the land had been assessed for, and to someone who did not understand the engineering report or the methodology for infrastructure-adjacent appraisals, it might have. She thanked Pruitt for the offer and said she would review it with her attorney and respond within the statutory time frame. She watched Pruitt absorb the word statutory. She watched him understand that she knew what the statutory time frame was, which meant she knew the process, and which meant this was not going to be the simple, friendly negotiation he had been expecting. Marcus said very little during the meeting. He was there to observe and to signal by his presence alone that she was not navigating this unrepresented. On the walk back to his car, he told her she had handled it exactly right. "They'll come back with a better number," he said, "and then we'll talk about what better looks like relative to what this land is actually worth." She drove home through the county's winter landscape, the fields bare and gray under a sky the color of old concrete. She thought about the number on the letter. $44,000. 2 years ago, $44,000 would have been a rescue, a reshaping of everything, the kind of number that turned the lights back on and kept them on. She would have been overwhelmed by it. She still needed money. That had not changed. But she had also spent the past year learning to see the land for what it was rather than what other people said it was, and she understood now that accepting the first number would be the same thing as agreeing that the assessed value was the truth, when the truth was something the engineering report had already told a different story about. Delia's appraisal arrived in the second week of December. It was a formal document, dense and carefully structured, referencing comparable acquisitions, infrastructure-adjacent land valuation methodology, and the specific geological and positional characteristics of the Gentry Ravine parcel. The final number, supported by 30 pages of methodology and documentation, was $162,000. She read the number 3 times. Then she called Marcus. He read the full appraisal and called her back 2 hours later. His voice carried a composed kind of satisfaction, the tone of a man who has had his preliminary assessment confirmed. He said the methodology was sound, the documentation was thorough, and the number was defensible. He said the county would dispute it. He said they should let them. She did not tell her family yet. She sat with the information in the same careful way she had sat with everything else, holding it close, checking it from different angles, making sure it was as solid as it felt. She had learned that hope and certainty were not the same thing, and that moving as though they had costs she could not always see in advance. But in the evenings, when Massey was at the table doing homework and the house was warm and ordinary around them, Nora found herself sitting with a quietness that felt different from the exhausted silence of the past 2 years. Not peace exactly and not certainty, but something that had the same temperature as both of them. The county's response to Delia's appraisal came in January. It arrived in the form of a counter-offer letter accompanied by a 20-page rebuttal of the appraisal methodology, which Marcus told her was standard procedure, that every infrastructure acquisition went through the same back and forth, and that the rebuttal, however detailed, did not actually undermine the core of Delia's analysis, but was designed to create the impression of technical dispute and apply pressure through complexity. And the counteroffer was $78,000, almost double their initial number, still less than half of Delia's appraisal. The gap between those two figures was where the real negotiation lived, and both sides knew it. It was also in January that the news about the reservoir project became public in a way that it had not been before. A local newspaper ran a story about the infrastructure study and the county board's preliminary endorsement of the Eastern Corridor site. The story was detailed and included quotes from county commissioners about the importance of the project to the region's long-term water security. One commissioner used the phrase, "no viable alternative," when describing why the eastern site had been selected. Another said the county was committed to completing land acquisition efficiently and fairly, which was the kind of statement that contained more information in what it did not say than in what it did. The story mentioned that land acquisition was underway with private parcel owners in the Gentry Ravine section. It did not name anyone specifically. Dana called the morning the story ran. She had read it. She had read it carefully, which Nora could tell from the particular quality of her sister's voice, that careful, recalibrating tone that appeared when Dana was in the process of revising a position she had held confidently. "Is this your land?" Dana asked. "The ravine section." "Part of it is mine," Nora said. A pause. "How much of it?" "My parcel is on the eastern and southern side of the acquisition corridor." Another pause, longer. "Nora, when were you going to tell me?" "When there was something definite to tell. The county is calling it their best site. They're saying there's no alternative. That means your land is—" Dana stopped herself. "How long have you known?" "I've been watching it develop since November." The silence on the line had a different quality than their usual silences. Nora could hear her sister processing, the sound of certainty being gently but thoroughly restructured. "The appraisal," Dana said finally, her voice quieter now. "Have you had it appraised?" "Yes." "What did it come back at?" Nora told her. She heard Dana draw a slow breath. "And the county offered." Nora told her the county's current position. Another breath. "You have an attorney," Dana said. It was not quite a question. "Yes." A long pause. Then Dana said something Nora had not expected, delivered in the voice her sister used when she was being honest in a way that cost her something. "I'm sorry," Dana said, "for the ravine comment, for the hole-in-the-ground comment. I should have—" She stopped. "I didn't understand what you were doing." "Neither did I entirely," Nora said, which was true. "But you held on to it." "I held on to it." There was a silence between them that was not uncomfortable, the kind of silence that happens when a relationship is quietly adjusting itself to a new configuration and both people can feel it happening. "What can I do?" Dana asked. "Nothing yet," Nora said. "I'll let you know when I need something." She said it simply, without weight. But she heard it land the way she had intended it to land, not as a rebuke, but as information. Say she was navigating this. She had been navigating it. She would tell her sister when there was something to tell and ask for help when there was something to ask for, and both of those things would happen on a timeline she determined. The negotiations continued through February and into March, moving with the deliberate pace of two institutions that both understood the stakes and neither wanted to overplay. Marcus filed a formal response to the county's appraisal rebuttal, a document that Nora read in full and found both admirable in its precision and quietly aggressive in the way it dismantled each of the county's methodological objections. He told her this was the stage where the county would typically bring in its own appraiser, which would add time, which was the thing they had least of. She was thinking about time in a different way now. She thought about Roland Voss and the 31 years of patience, the steady payment of taxes on a piece of land that nobody had wanted until the county grew large enough to need it. She thought about his land surveying career, the years of reading terrain, understanding what ground was for before anyone else decided to ask the question. She thought about what it meant to see a thing clearly when everyone around you had dismissed it, and to trust that clarity even without anyone else to confirm it. She thought about her great-uncle in those November evenings, the way she sometimes thought about her grandfather, the way you think about people you did not know well enough who nevertheless shaped something essential about who you became. She thought Roland Voss had been a particular kind of patient person. Not passive, not resigned, but patient in the way that comes from understanding something deeply and knowing that understanding alone was sufficient, that the world would eventually confirm what you already knew. She was beginning to understand that kind of patience. She was beginning to feel it take shape inside her, not as something she had learned intellectually, but as something she had earned through 2 years of holding on to a piece of ground that everyone else had written off, through the electricity bills and the layoff and the pink permission slip and the $44,000 opening offer and the feeling of sitting in a county conference room with a number on a letter that was constructed to feel generous to someone who did not know better. As she knew better, and the knowing had not come from nowhere. It had come from paying attention, from reading the reports, from walking the land, from standing in the creek with her boots getting wet and understanding that specific existence was worth something that assessment values did not begin to measure. It had also, she was beginning to understand, come from Roland Voss, who had seen the same thing she was seeing and had waited for it to become true. The county hired its own appraiser in late February, as Marcus had predicted. The counter-appraisal, which arrived in early March, valued her parcel at $91,000, still below Delia's number, still, she noted, significantly above where they had started. The gap was narrowing. The gap narrowing was information. What happened next she had not entirely anticipated, though she recognized it in retrospect as the kind of thing that happens when a negotiation becomes visible to people who were not previously paying attention. The newspaper ran a follow-up story about the reservoir project, this one more detailed about the land acquisition process and the timeline pressure the county was under. The story included a map of the acquisition corridor. Anyone who knew the Gentry Ravine section could identify which parcels were involved. Several of them had already settled with the county at preliminary prices. The story also noted, without naming her, that at least one parcel owner had retained legal representation and had disputed the county's initial valuation based on an independent appraisal. It noted that this dispute was creating uncertainty in the acquisition timeline, and that commissioners had expressed concern about project delays. She found out about the story because 3 people called her that morning. The first was her former colleague Janet, who said simply, "That's you, isn't it?" And when Nora confirmed, it said, "Good for you," with a warmth that Nora had not expected, and that stayed with her for the rest of the day. The second caller was her cousin Robert, who asked a series of questions he framed as concern, but which were clearly motivated by something closer to amazement. He had seen the map in the newspaper. He had done some arithmetic. He said, with the particular discomfort of someone revising a confident prior position, that it sounded like the land might end up being worth considerably more than anyone had thought, and he used the word anyone in a way that was meant to be inclusive but functioned as an acknowledgement. She thanked him for calling and kept the conversation brief. The third caller was a man she did not know, who had found her through the public deed records and identified himself as a journalist for a regional news outlet who was working on a longer piece about the reservoir project and the land acquisition process. He said he was particularly interested in the stories of individual landowners and how the process was affecting them, and asked whether she would be willing to speak with him. She said she would think about it and would call him back. Marcus, when she told him about the journalist, was characteristically measured. He said speaking with the press during an active negotiation carried risks and benefits that needed to be thought through carefully. The benefit was public attention, which sometimes accelerated county decision-making. The risk was that it could harden the county's position if they felt they were being pressured publicly, or could create complications in the legal record if she said something imprecise that the county later used against her. He said the decision was hers, but that if she decided to speak, they should review what she planned to say. She sat with the question for 2 days, then called the journalist back and agreed to speak on background only, meaning her words could inform his reporting, but not be quoted directly or attributed to her by name. He agreed to those terms. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She told him what she had seen in the engineering report and what it meant about the site's viability. She told him how the process had unfolded. She told him carefully that she had retained an attorney and was pursuing a valuation that reflected what independent appraisal indicated her land was actually worth, rather than what the county had initially offered. She did not discuss specific numbers. She did not discuss strategy. She did tell him one thing that she had not planned to say, but which came out of a question he asked near the end, which was why she had held on to the land in the first place, why she hadn't sold it immediately when she inherited it or donated it the way the previous owners of similar parcels sometimes did. She thought about it for a moment before answering. "And someone left it to me who understood what land meant," she said. "He held on to it for 30 years because he saw something in it that other people didn't see. I'm not sure I understood that when I inherited it, but I think I understand it now." The journalist asked what her great-uncle had seen. She said she thought he had understood that the value of a specific piece of ground is not always visible from where other people are standing. She heard him writing. She thought about Roland Voss and his deliberate way of speaking, the way her family had described him, someone who asked questions and then waited for the full answer before responding. She thought about the 31 years of tax payments recorded in neat columns in the county's public files, uninterrupted, without complaint. She thought, is sitting in her kitchen in the March light with her county survey maps on the table and her daughter's school papers spread across the other end and her legal pad filled with notes from 2 months of reading and preparing and navigating a negotiation that everyone except her and her attorney had expected to be simple. She thought that Roland Voss had been patient the way a good surveyor is patient. He had looked at the land and measured it, and understood what it was, and then he had waited for the world to come around to the same understanding. She was his great-niece, which meant she had inherited more than 18 acres. She had inherited the patience to hold them. Outside, the March light moved across the fields in the slow, deliberate way it moved in the county's eastern sections. Yet where the terrain was rougher, and the shadows lasted longer. In a few weeks, the frost would lift from the ravine floor. The creek would run high with snowmelt and spring rain. The rock walls would dry out and lighten. The narrow corridor of sky above the ravine floor would fill with the particular blue of an early April morning, clear and specific and belonging entirely to that place. She would go out there again, she decided. Not yet, but soon. She would stand at the bottom of the ravine with the water moving past and the walls rising around her, and she would feel the same thing she had felt every time she had stood there, that irreducible specificity, that sense of a place that existed in its own terms, indifferent to what anyone had decided it was worth, that she would stand there, and she would know that she had held on when everyone around her had agreed there was nothing worth holding. And she would know that the world, in its slow and reluctant way, was in the process of catching up. The second week of March brought rain that lasted 4 days without interruption, the kind of slow, patient rain that did not announce itself dramatically, but simply settled in and refused to leave. It came down in a fine, continuous curtain across the county's eastern hills, darkening the roads, filling the creek beds, turning the unimproved track that led to the Gentry Ravine parcel into something that would have swallowed a car to its axles. Nora watched it from the window of her kitchen each morning before Macy woke up, drinking her first cup of coffee in the gray light and thinking about the ravine floor, about how high the water would be running now, about what a hydrologist would measure if they were standing at the base of the rock walls during a rain event like this one. She was thinking like that now, in the specific technical language that the engineering report had given her. She had read that report enough times that its vocabulary had become part of her working vocabulary, the way the language of property transfers and deed descriptions had become part of her vocabulary during her years at the county office. She thought in terms of watershed catchment and channel efficiency and bedrock anchor points the way she had once thought in terms of easement widths and parcel boundaries and tax assessment methodologies. Language was a tool, and she had spent the past several months acquiring the tools she needed for this particular work. Marcus called on the Thursday of that rain week with news that he delivered in his characteristically flat, informational tone, the tone that did not dramatize because it understood that the facts, properly arranged, were dramatic enough on their own. The county had requested a mediated negotiation session. She asked him what that meant in practical terms. He said it meant they wanted to settle without going to court. It meant their own internal timeline analysis had confirmed that litigation, even if they ultimately prevailed, would push the reservoir project's groundbreaking past the window the county board had publicly committed to. It meant that the commissioner who had used the phrase "no viable alternative" in the newspaper had been more accurate than he intended, and because the phrase applied not just to the Eastern Corridor versus the other sites, but to her specific parcel versus every alternative acquisition route the county's engineers had examined in the past 60 days. She asked if there were no alternatives. Marcus was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was being precise. He said there was one theoretical routing adjustment that would avoid her parcel by shifting the anchor infrastructure approximately 200 meters to the north. He said the county's own engineers had examined it. He said it would require acquiring an additional 3 parcels, 2 of which were currently under active agricultural use with associated complications, would add an estimated 14 months to the construction timeline, and would increase the projected project cost by somewhere between $2.3 and $3.8 million. She understood what that meant without needing him to say it directly. The county's choice was not between acquiring her land and finding another way. The county's choice was between paying her what her land was actually worth and paying $2 to $4 million more than that, plus 14 months of delay to avoid doing so. She said she understood. She asked when the mediation session was proposed for. He said the following week. He asked if she was ready. She thought about that question for a moment in the silence of her kitchen, and with the rain coming down outside and the coffee going cold in her hand, and the county survey maps spread on the table the way they had been spread on the table almost every evening for the past 4 months. She said she was ready. The mediation happened on a Tuesday, which was the same day of the week the electricity had been cut off in November of the previous year. She noticed the coincidence when she checked the date on the calendar above the kitchen counter. She did not think it meant anything in particular, but she noted it the way she noted most things now, with the attention of someone who had learned that small details were worth recording. She drove to the county seat in the early morning, the rain finally having lifted the night before, and leaving behind a sky of particular clarity, and the kind that appears in early spring after extended overcast, as if the clouds had decided to make a point about what was possible when they stepped aside. She drove her car with its cracked windshield through that clear morning light and thought about nothing specific, which was how she had learned to approach important moments, by clearing the space around them rather than filling it with anticipation. Marcus was already in the conference room when she arrived, his briefcase open, papers arranged in the precise order she had come to recognize as his working pattern. He looked up when she walked in and gave her a brief nod that carried in it everything he needed to communicate. She was prepared. The documentation was solid. The position was defensible. And what happened next would be a conversation between two parties who both understood the reality of the situation, and the question was only whether they could agree on the language to describe that reality. Gerald Pruitt was there with two colleagues and a county attorney whose presence confirmed that this was not a preliminary conversation, but a serious attempt at resolution. The mediator was a retired judge named Carolyn Stahl, a compact woman in her 60s with silver hair and the measured attention of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people disagreed about things that mattered. She introduced herself, explained the process briefly, and asked that both sides present their current positions before discussion began. Pruitt went first. He presented the county's position with the same professional warmth he had used in every previous meeting, though Nora noticed a quality beneath it, now that had not been there in November, not quite strain, but the particular careful control of someone who understood that the ground had shifted since the first meeting and was managing that understanding in real time. He described the project's importance to the county. He described the county's commitment to fair treatment of private landowners. He described the counter-appraisal at $91,000 as the county's best assessment of fair market value and suggested that the gap between that figure and the independent appraisal might be addressed through a modest adjustment in recognition of the acquisition's timeline requirements. He used the word modest carefully. She noted it. Marcus presented her position with the same methodical clarity he brought to every document he produced. He walked through Delia's appraisal methodology point by point, addressing each of the county's rebuttal arguments in the order they had been raised and explaining why each one did not materially alter the core valuation. He referenced the specific sections of the engineering report that described the parcel's positional necessity. He did not use the word leverage. He did not need to. The argument was self-contained, and its conclusion was stated in plain language that left no ambiguity about where she stood. $162,000 was the appraised value. That was the figure she was prepared to accept. Anything below it would proceed to the formal condemnation process under state statute. Dr. Carolyn Stahl listened to both presentations without interruption, making occasional notes. When Marcus finished, she asked several questions of each side, probing the methodologies, establishing the factual record with the precision of someone who had learned that facts, precisely established, were the only foundation on which agreements held. She asked Pruitt about the routing alternative and the associated cost differential. She asked Marcus about the methodology for infrastructure adjacent valuation. She asked both parties about the timeline requirements and what delay would mean in practical terms for the project. Then she called a recess of 30 minutes and left the room. Nora sat in the quiet of the conference room while Pruitt and his colleagues stepped into the hallway. Marcus poured her a glass of water from the pitcher on the table and said nothing, which was the right thing to say. Outside the window, the early spring morning continued its particular clarity over the county seat, the buildings and streets sharp in the post-rain light. She thought about the electricity being cut off. She thought about the pink permission slip. She thought about sitting at her kitchen table with a candle she had found under the sink and a letter from an attorney's office in a town called Cressfield. She thought about the $11,000 assessed value and the first time she had looked at that number and understood that it was describing something without understanding what it was describing. She thought about Macy asleep in her room on a November night, It sprawled diagonally across her bed without anxiety about the space she took up, breathing with the easy rhythm of a child who trusted that the morning would come and that someone would be there for it. She had been that person. She had been there every morning, regardless of what the previous day had cost her. She had kept the lights on when she could and lit candles when she couldn't, and told her daughter the truth in the measured portions that a 7-year-old could hold. She had done all of it without complaint and without the particular performance of sacrifice that would have turned her own struggle into a burden for her child to carry. She had done it because Macy needed her to, and because she was the kind of person who did what was needed, and because somewhere beneath both of those reasons was a stubbornness that she had not fully understood about herself until the past year had required it of her. She had also done it because Roland Voss had left her 18 acres, and she had refused to let them go. Carolyn Stahl came back into the room 14 minutes before the recess was scheduled to end. She sat down and looked at both parties with the equidistant attention of someone who had been in many rooms and understood which ones had a resolution available and which ones did not. This one did. She said so directly, which Nora appreciated. She said both parties had legitimate positions that were supported by their respective documentation, and that the gap between those positions was not a disagreement about facts, but a disagreement about methodology, which was a more tractable problem. She proposed a bridging figure. It was not the median of the two appraisals. It was a number derived from a specific adjustment to the county's counter-appraisal that incorporated the infrastructure-adjacent premium that Delia's methodology had applied and which the county's appraiser had declined to apply, but which the engineering report, read in full context, clearly supported. The number Carolyn Stahl put on the table was $141,000. Gerald Pruitt looked at his colleagues. One of them wrote something on a notepad and pushed it toward him. He read it without expression. Marcus looked at Nora. He did not say anything. He did not need to. The number was below Delia's appraisal. But it was within the range that Delia had described as defensible given the methodological uncertainty in infrastructure-adjacent cases. It was $141,000 more than the $11,000 assessed value that had been the only number associated with the Gentry Ravine parcel for as long as anyone had been paying attention. She looked at Carolyn Stahl and asked a single question. She asked whether the county would fund the survey and closing costs in addition to the acquisition price. There was a brief consultation at the county's end of the table. Pruitt said yes. She looked at Marcus. He gave the smallest possible nod, which in his economy of gesture was the equivalent of a declaration. She said she would accept the county's offer. The paperwork took another 3 hours. She signed her name in the places indicated and initialed in the margins, and answered the questions asked of her by the county attorney with the same careful precision she had applied to every document in this process. When it was finished, Carolyn Stahl shook her hand with a directness that conveyed respect without commentary, and Gerald Pruitt shook her hand with the professional grace of a man who had wanted a different outcome and was handling the one he had gotten with appropriate dignity. She drove home through the early spring afternoon in her car with the cracked windshield, and the packing tape holding the glass together caught the light in a way it sometimes did, breaking it into small, separate pieces that scattered across the dashboard. She thought about the first thing she was going to do. It was not what people might have expected. It was not a celebration or a purchase or a phone call to her sister or any of the gestures that arrival after a long journey is supposed to involve. The first thing she was going to do, she decided, was drive out to the Gentry Ravine parcel one more time. She drove directly from the county seat without stopping at home first. The route through the eastern corridor was familiar to her now, in the way that a path becomes familiar when you have walked it in all weathers and in all states of mind. She drove it with the particular attention of someone saying goodbye to something, noting the way the terrain shifted east of the county road, the way the hills thickened and the flatlands gave way to the rougher, more specific landscape of the eastern section. She parked at the road and walked in through the high grass of early spring, already greening at the base where last autumn's growth had kept the moisture through the winter. The unimproved track was soft underfoot from the recent rains, and her boots sank slightly with each step, in a way that felt like the land accommodating her presence. She came through the tree line to the ravine lip and stopped. The creek was running high and fast, filling the ravine floor from wall to wall in the narrower sections. A cold, dark rush of snowmelt and rain moving through the rock channel with the deliberate force of water that knew exactly where it was going. The sound of it rose from below in a continuous, uninterrupted voice that she had never heard quite like this before, this full and certain. She descended the slope carefully, finding her footholds in the wet rock, moving down into the shadow of the ravine walls, the way she had moved down into it every time before, with the same care and the same attention and the same feeling of entering a place that existed by its own rules. The air at the bottom was cold and smelled of wet stone and moving water and the specific mineral quality of the Gentry Formation that she had read described in engineering language as bedrock substrate of exceptional consistency. She stood at the water's edge with the walls rising 40 feet on either side and the narrow corridor of early spring sky overhead and listened to the creek moving past her. She was thinking about her great-uncle Roland. She was thinking about him standing in this same place. Like at some point in the years between 1991 when he acquired the parcel and whatever November or December or March afternoon, he had walked out here and decided that this piece of ground was worth paying taxes on for the rest of his life. She was thinking about what he would have seen and heard. Whether the creek had been running high the way it was running now, whether the walls had been this dark with moisture, whether the sky had been exactly this shade of early spring blue in the precise corridor above him. She was thinking about the fact that he had never told anyone what he saw here. He had simply seen it, and then he had held on to it, and then he had left it to her. She did not know whether he had known the reservoir would come, and she did not know whether his years of land surveying had given him some technical understanding of what this terrain was suited for, whether he had read the county's growth projections, whether he had done the kind of patient research she had done, or whether he had simply stood where she was standing and felt what she always felt when she stood here. That irreducible certainty that specific ground is worth something that numbers cannot contain. Both possibilities felt true to her. She thought Roland Voss had been the kind of man who did not require a single explanation for any decision. He had been deliberate and patient, and he had held a thing in his hands for 31 years without letting go. And the reason could have been technical or instinctive or simply stubborn, and it would not have mattered to him which one it was. What mattered was the holding. She understood that now in a way she had not understood at the beginning. She had inherited the land as something given to her. She had held on to it as something chosen. The distance between those two things was the distance between the woman who sat by candlelight reading a letter from an attorney in Cressfield and the woman who stood at the bottom of a ravine in the early spring light, knowing that she had navigated 18 months of mockery and financial pressure and institutional negotiation to arrive at a number that no one around her had believed was possible. $141,000. She said it aloud in the ravine, not loudly, just clearly, the way you say something when you need to hear it in the air rather than only in your head. The creek moved past without comment, and the walls held their position. The sky remained exactly the particular blue it had been. She climbed back out and drove home. The conversation with Dana that evening was different from every conversation they had ever had about money or land, or the practical arrangements of Nora's life. Dana cried, which Nora had not expected, and which produced in her a complicated tenderness, because she understood that her sister's tears were not simply about the outcome, but about the 18 months of quietly believing Nora was wrong and the particular private cost of that belief being so thoroughly reversed. She told Dana the number. She heard her sister breathe. "Nora," Dana said, "I know." "That's—" Dana stopped. Started again. "That's life-changing." "Yes," Nora said simply. "What are you going to do?" She had thought about this carefully over the past hours, sitting in her car, walking the ravine, driving home through the early spring afternoon. She had thought about it the way she thought about everything now, methodically, with the specific attention of someone who understood that decisions made from abundance required the same careful consideration as decisions made from scarcity. Possibly more. She told Dana the first thing. The car. The cracked windshield had been held together by packing tape for 11 months, and she was going to replace it. Not just the glass, but the car itself, something reliable and safe, because she drove Macy in that car every day, and reliable and safe were things she was going to stop treating as luxuries. She told Dana the second thing, the rent, that she was going to find a better place to live, not extravagant, not showy, but a place where the house was sound and the heat worked properly in winter, and Macy had a bedroom that was large enough to be comfortable rather than manageable. She told Dana the third thing, Macy's education. She had already looked into it during the evenings when the negotiation was most uncertain, and she had needed something concrete to think about. There was a fund she could establish, modest but meaningful, that would grow over the years until Macy was old enough to need it. She told Dana the fourth thing. She was going to pay back the 2 months of rent Dana had covered, with interest, not because Dana expected it, but because Nora needed to. Because accepting help and then being able to return it was its own kind of completion. That Dana was quiet for a moment after the fourth thing. Then she said, with the particular sincerity of someone who has set aside their normal mode of communication in favor of the direct version, that she did not need the money back. Nora said she knew that. She said she was returning it anyway. There was a pause, and then Dana laughed, a genuine laugh, surprised out of her. She said that was exactly the most Nora thing she had ever heard. Nora smiled in her kitchen, alone, with the survey map still spread on the table and the legal pad still full of notes from a negotiation that was now complete. She did not tell her sister the fifth thing right away. The fifth thing was private, still forming, not ready to be spoken aloud to anyone other than herself. The fifth thing was this. She was going to go back to school. She had thought about it obliquely for years, the way you think about things that seem impossible in the present arrangement of your life, as a kind of background awareness rather than a plan. She had an associate's degree in administrative studies from the county community college, earned before McKee, before the marriage, before the version of her life that had eventually returned in poor condition. She had thought sometimes about what a bachelor's degree in land use planning or environmental management would have meant for the work she did, about the doors that credential would have opened, and the authority it would have given her in conversations she had been navigating without it. She was 34 years old. She had a daughter and a part-time job, and a negotiation she had just completed without a 4-year degree. So using only the tools she had built for herself over years of paying attention. She thought about what she could do with the proper credential on top of those tools. She thought about the people she had worked with during this process, the engineers and the attorneys and the appraisers who had spoken the language of land and infrastructure and resource planning, and she thought that she had understood almost everything they said, and that the gap between understanding and speaking that language with institutional authority was a gap she could close. She thought she would close it. She did not know yet the specific shape that decision would take. She did not know which program, which timeline, which arrangement of part-time work and coursework and Macy's school schedule would make it possible. She only knew that she was going to do it the way she had known, sitting by candlelight in a dark kitchen, that she was going to hold on to 18 acres of ravine. Not because she could see clearly to the end of the path, but because she could see clearly enough to take the next step, and the step after that, and the step after that, which was the only way any path was ever walked. She folded the survey maps for the last time, carefully, along their original creases. She put them on the shelf with the ledger where she had recorded every tax payment on the Gentry Ravine parcel, every cost of holding the land through the past 18 months. She looked at the total in the ledger for a moment, the accumulated cost of 18 acres of nothing in particular. Then she closed it. She made dinner for Massie, a pasta from a box that her daughter had loved since she was 4, and which remained, regardless of what changed around them, one of the fixed points of contentment in their household. They ate at the kitchen table, Macy talking about something that had happened at school, involving a disagreement about a game at recess and the moral complexity in the specific moral universe of 2nd grade, of the resolution that had been reached. Nora listened with the full attention she always gave to these reports, because the reports were what Massie trusted her with, and that trust was the most specific and irreducible thing in her life. After dinner, she told Massie. She did not tell her everything. She told her the essential parts, translated into the scale and language that a 7-year-old could hold. She said that the land great-great-uncle Roland had left her was worth a lot of money, and that the county had bought it because they needed it for an important project, and that they were going to be able to do some things now that they had not been able to do before. Makey asked what things. Nora said they were going to get a new car, one where the window was not held together with tape. Macy found this extremely funny, the tape having been a source of low-grade embarrassment for the better part of a year. She said they were going to find a better house to live in. Macy asked whether she would have to change schools. Nora said no. She had already thought about this specifically. The radius she was looking within kept them in the same school district. Macy considered this information with the particular seriousness of a 7-year-old processing something large. Then she asked whether Nora's great-great-uncle Roland had known the land was going to be worth a lot of money. Nora thought about the question. She said she wasn't sure. She said she thought maybe he had known that it was worth holding on to, and that sometimes holding on to something was the same thing as knowing it was worth something, even if you could not say exactly what. Macy thought about that. Then she said that was like how she had kept a friendship bracelet that a girl at her old school had given her, even after they moved and she didn't see the girl anymore, because it felt wrong to throw it away. Nora said that was exactly like it. Macy went to bed without argument, which was rare enough to be noted, and Nora stood in the doorway of her room for a moment, watching her daughter settle into sleep with the same diagonal sprawl, the same easy rhythm of breathing, the same unbothered claiming of space. She turned off the light and went to the living room and sat in the quiet for a while. The word vindication had never sat entirely comfortably with her. It suggested something adversarial that she did not feel, some triumph over opponents that did not map accurately onto her experience of the past 18 months. The county had not been her enemy. Pruitt had been a professional doing his job, which was to acquire land at the lowest defensible price, the same way her job had been to understand what defensible meant and not to accept less than it. Her sister had not been her enemy. Dana had been a person with a different vantage point who had offered practical concern in the only language available to her and had been gracious in the revision. Even Robert, with his insurance salesman's arithmetic and his cautionary tales about people who paid more in taxes than their land was worth, even Robert had simply been wrong in the way that confident people are wrong when they make assessments without complete information, which was a kind of wrongness she recognized in herself at other points in her life and did not require punishment. What she felt was not vindication in the adversarial sense. It was more like resolution, the resolution of a tension that had been building since the night she sat by candlelight and decided, without entirely knowing why, to accept the inheritance rather than decline it. The resolution of 18 months of paying attention to a piece of ground that no one else was paying attention to and holding on to it through the electricity being cut off and the job disappearing and the pink permission slip and the $44,000 opening offer and every quiet moment of doubt that she had not expressed aloud, because expressing it aloud would have given it a kind of permanence she had refused to grant it. She thought about what the resolution meant specifically. Not in large terms, not in the language of life-changing or fortune reversed, though those words were not inaccurate. In specific terms. In the terms of her actual life. It meant that Massey would go to college if she wanted to go to college, and the conversation about whether it was possible would be different from what it would otherwise have been. It meant that when the car needed a repair, the repair would happen without a week of arithmetic first. It meant that when the school field trip cost $40 would exist to cover it. It meant that the version of scarcity she had been navigating for 2 years, the constant background calculation of what could be covered and what would have to wait and what would have to be declined, that version was over. It did not mean everything was solved. She was not naive about money in the way that people who have never managed without it sometimes are. Money solved the problems that money solved, which were specific and important problems, but not all problems. Macy still needed to grow up. Nora still needed to be present for that growing up in the way she had been present through the hard version of it. And the relationship with Dana still needed the quiet work of 2 adult sisters who loved each other and sometimes did not understand each other and were in the slow process of learning to hold both things at once. None of those things changed. They simply happened now against a different background, one that was less exhausting, one that did not require her to spend a portion of every day on the arithmetic that consumed energy that could have gone elsewhere. She went to the kitchen and stood at the counter where the pink permission slip had sat on the same day the electricity was cut off. The counter was clear now, just the ordinary surfaces of an ordinary kitchen. She stood there for a moment in the quiet of the house and let herself feel the weight of the past 18 months fully. Not just the outcome, but the passage. And the specific quality of each month of it, the November letter and the December drive out to the ravine and the January silence, where the engineering report had begun to tell its story, and the spring visits to the creek, and the summer of the layoff, and the fall of the first negotiations, and the winter of the counter-offers, and the March morning that had come out on the other side of all of it with the cracked windshield catching the light and the sky clear after rain. She had been present for all of it. She had not been absent from any of it. She had paid attention the whole way through, to the land and to the documents and to the process and to her daughter and to the specific truth of what 18 acres in a ravine was worth when you refused to let other people tell you what it was worth. She had done that. She had done it in the specific way that only she could have done it, with the specific knowledge she had built over years at the county records office, and the specific stubbornness she had not fully understood about herself, until the past 18 months had required it, and the specific inheritance from a man she had barely known, who had nevertheless handed her something that turned out to be exactly the thing she needed. She thought about Roland Voss one more time, standing in his kitchen in some earlier November, or sitting in his car on the county road looking at the track that led toward the ravine in whatever private language he used to think about things. As she thought about what he would say if he could see the resolution of the story he had set in motion 31 years ago when he paid $8,000 to a timber company for a piece of ground nobody wanted. She thought he would say nothing. She thought he would simply nod, the way deliberate people nod when something they already understood has finally been confirmed by the world. She thought he would be satisfied not with the vindication, but with the patience having proved sufficient, with the holding having turned out to be enough. She was his great niece. She had inherited more than the land. She had inherited the understanding that some things are worth more than the world's current assessment of them, that the gap between what a thing is valued at and what it is actually worth is a space that patience and attention can inhabit, and that sometimes the most important decision is not the grand gesture or the dramatic act, but the quiet refusal to let go of something that everyone else has agreed to write off. She had refused, and the ground beneath her had turned out to be more solid than anyone had thought. Outside the kitchen window, the early spring night moved over the county in its slow and indifferent way, the same night that moved over the Gentry ravine, over the creek still running high with rain and snowmelt, over the rock walls that had been there longer than any of the decisions made around them, and over the narrow corridor of dark sky where during the day you could see exactly the kind of blue that belonged entirely to that place and nowhere else. In a few years, the ravine would hold water. The creek would be dammed at its southern end and the formation would fill slowly, the rock walls becoming the banks of a reservoir that would serve the county's eastern sections for the next 50 years. The engineer's language, natural architectural efficiency, would become an engineering fact, the terrain doing what it had always been suited to do, channeling and holding the water that the surrounding hills gathered and directed toward this particular low point in the landscape. Roland Voss had bought the parcel that bracketed that low point. He had held it quietly for 31 years. He had left it to the great niece he barely knew, which was either foresight or stubbornness or both. And she had held it for 18 more months, which was its own form of the same thing. The reservoir would bear a name that the county board would vote on in a meeting she might attend or might not. The engineering report would be archived in the county's public records. The deed transfer, stamped and filed, would sit in the same office where she had once processed transfers for other people's land, waiting to be found by whoever next pulled the parcel's history. Her name would be on it, and Roland Voss's name before hers. And between those two names, 31 years of tax payments and 1 year of something she did not have a single word for, something made of attention and stubbornness, and a refusal to believe that the assessed value was the whole truth. She turned off the kitchen light. She checked on Macy one more time, standing in the doorway of the room in the dark, listening to the easy rhythm of her daughter's breathing. She went to bed and slept without difficulty. The second time in 18 months that sleep had come without the arithmetic running beneath it, without the specific weight of inadequacy that had sat on her chest for 2 years, like a stone she had gotten so used to carrying that she had almost stopped noticing it was there. The stone was gone. The ground beneath her was solid. The morning would come, and she would be there for it, and Macy would be there, and the car with the cracked windshield would make its last few trips before she replaced it. And then the county would begin its project in the spring, and the Gentry Ravine would begin its slow transformation from a piece of dismissed terrain to a piece of essential infrastructure, and none of it, not one day of it, would have happened if she had done what everyone around her agreed she should do and let the land go. She had not let it go. That was the whole story. That was all of it. 18 acres of ravine and a woman who refused to believe the world when it told her what they were worth. And the world, in the patient and impersonal way it confirms things it was never going to confirm easily, had come around. The settlement funds arrived in her bank account on the 5th of April, a Thursday, at 7:43 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she had been awake since 6, not anxiously, not the way she had been awake in the dark hours of the past 2 years when insomnia arrived carrying arithmetic. This was a different kind of wakefulness, clean and still, the kind that comes when a long chapter of something has ended and the next one has not yet fully begun, and the space between them is briefly, surprisingly peaceful. She had made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and watched the light come up over the eastern part of the county, and at 7:43 she had checked her account on her phone and seen the number sitting there, settled and real, the same number that had been abstract and then possible and then agreed upon, and now, finally, actual. She set the phone down and finished her coffee. She did not call anyone. She did not tell Macy at breakfast, who was focused entirely on a disagreement she was constructing in her head about the fairness of the school's new policy on recess equipment, a topic that deserved its full share of attention. She drove her daughter to school and said goodbye, and watched her walk through the entrance doors with the particular rolling gait of a child carrying a backpack slightly too large for her frame, and then she drove to the dealership. She had done the research already. She had not been impulsive about it, and she was not going to start. She knew the make and model and the year and the approximate price and the fuel economy and the safety ratings, and she knew the color she wanted, which was a dark blue that she had liked since she was young without ever having had occasion to act on the preference. Then she walked into the dealership at 9 in the morning and spoke with a salesman who was very young and very eager and who clearly expected the conversation to proceed in the usual way, with uncertainty and hesitation and the need to be walked through options. She told him exactly what she wanted. She paid for it without financing. She drove it off the lot at 10:15 with the particular feeling of someone who has spent an extended period of time managing the distance between what they needed and what they could afford and has just for the first time in that extended period closed that distance entirely. The drive home in the dark blue car on a bright April morning was one of the better drives of her life. She allowed herself that. She had been careful with celebration the way she had been careful with hope. At rationing both against the risk of disappointment, and now that disappointment was no longer the operative risk, she permitted herself to feel the full weight of what the morning represented. Not just the car, not just the number in the account. The full weight of 18 months of patience and attention and stubbornness and the slow, private work of refusing to accept other people's assessments of what things were worth. She drove east on the county road, out past the point where the terrain shifted and the hills began to assert themselves, past the turnoff for the Gentry ravine track that she could now identify from the road without looking at a map. She did not turn in. She drove past it and continued east for another mile and then pulled over and looked out the window at the eastern hills in the April light. And somewhere in that landscape, the county's engineers were already in the preliminary stages of the site work that would precede construction. She had read about it in the Planning Commission's agenda, the survey crews, the environmental assessments, the infrastructure studies that would take most of the year before groundbreaking could begin. The ravine that had been her problem, and then her inheritance, and then her negotiation, would spend the next several years becoming something else, something public and necessary and permanent. And eventually, the particular piece of ground she had stood on with her boots getting wet would be 30 feet beneath the surface of a reservoir that would serve the county's eastern sections for half a century. But she had thought about that transformation and found that it did not produce in her any sense of loss. The land had never belonged to her in any permanent way. It had belonged to itself, in the way that terrain belongs to itself, shaped by forces that preceded any human decision about ownership. She had been its custodian for 18 months, and Roland Voss had been its custodian for 31 years before her, and in a few years the water would come, and the shape of things would change, and the parcel designation would be absorbed into the infrastructure record and eventually into the county's history. What remained was what the land had made possible, and that was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole point. She drove back through the county seat and stopped at the attorney's office. Marcus Webb was between appointments, and he came out to the lobby when she arrived and shook her hand with the same brief, precise warmth he had brought to every meeting, then noticed the car through the window and allowed himself a small smile, which in his economy of expression was the equivalent of a standing ovation. She thanked him. She meant it in the full sense, not just for the negotiation, but for the manner of it, for the plain language and the methodical preparation, and the particular way he had never treated the process as though it required dramatizing, which had allowed her to stay calm through the parts of it that had not been calm at all. He said it had been good work on her part. He said that the preparation she had brought to the first meeting had set the tone for everything that followed, and that most people in her situation would not have read a 214-page engineering report. She said she had had a reason to read it carefully. He said that was true of every document she had ever read, which was a more perceptive thing to say than she had expected, and which she thought about for the rest of the afternoon. She picked Macy up from school that afternoon in the dark blue car. Her daughter stopped on the sidewalk and looked at it with the expression of a child encountering something that does not fit the established order of things. She asked where the tape was. Nora said the tape was gone. Macy considered the car for another moment, circling slowly, trailing her backpack from one hand. Then she opened the passenger door and got in, and immediately began adjusting the seat controls with the specific delight that children bring to anything that has buttons. They drove home through the April afternoon in the dark blue car, with Macy telling her about recess and the equipment policy and the complex interpersonal situation it had generated, and Nora listened with her full attention the way she always did. And the ordinary afternoon moved around them in its ordinary way, and the only thing different about it was the car and the absence of the arithmetic and the particular quality of light that comes through glass that is not fractured, clear, and even, and without the small scattered pieces that the old windshield used to make. In the weeks that followed, she began the work of the transition in the same methodical way she had approached everything else. She researched neighborhoods within the school district, attended 3 open houses, and found a house that was not large or impressive but was sound, with a furnace that worked and windows that sealed and a small backyard with a tree in it that Macy declared immediately and without reservation to be a climbing tree, which settled the question of whether it was the right house. She signed the lease on a Thursday, which she noticed continued to be the day when significant things happened, a coincidence she acknowledged with the same mild attention she gave to all small patterns without investing them with undue meaning. The move took a Saturday and most of a Sunday. Dana drove down with her husband to help, by arriving with a truck and a practical efficiency that Nora recognized as her sister's primary love language. They moved boxes and furniture through the bright spring weekend without much ceremony, and at the end of the second day, sitting on the porch of the new house with cups of coffee that Dana had produced from somewhere, they had a conversation that was quieter and more honest than most of the conversations they had had in the past several years. Dana said she had been thinking about what she had gotten wrong and why. Nora said she did not need Dana to do that. Dana said she knew, but that she needed to do it anyway, for herself. She said she had operated on the assumption that practical advice was the same thing as useful advice, and that the two things were not identical, and that she had confused them often enough that she wanted to name it. Nora thought about that. She said that practical advice had its uses, that the 2 months of rent had been an act of genuine love, and that she had not forgotten it. Dana said she knew. She said there was a difference between helping someone stay afloat and believing in what they were swimming toward, and that she had done the first without the second, and that the second mattered. Nora looked at her sister across the porch of the new house in the late spring light and thought that this was the real outcome of the past 18 months, not the number in her bank account, not the dark blue car, not even the sound of Macy's voice from inside the house asking whether she was allowed to climb the tree before dinner. And the real outcome was this conversation, this specific and honest exchange between two sisters who had always loved each other and had sometimes failed to see each other clearly, and were now on a porch in April, working their way toward the clearer version. She told Dana about the fifth thing, about school, about the program in land use planning at the State University's Continuing Education Division, which she had applied to 3 weeks after the settlement and been accepted to, starting in the fall. Dana sat with it for a moment, then nodded slowly. She said that made sense in a way that nothing else could have quite completed the story. Nora said she was not sure it was about completing a story. She said she thought it was about having the right tools for the work she already understood she wanted to do. Dana asked what work that was, if she thought about it. She said she thought it was work that had something to do with the gap between what land is assessed at and what it is actually worth, with the people and the parcels and the histories that fall into that gap and disappear, with paying attention to what gets dismissed because it does not fit the current accounting. She said she was still working out the specifics. Dana said she thought that was probably the most Roland Voss thing she had ever heard. Nora laughed. It was a real laugh, full and easy, the kind she had not heard from herself in some time. Before the summer arrived, she made one more trip she had been planning since the settlement came through. She drove the 2 hours north to Cressfield, the small town whose name had appeared on the return address of the letter that had started everything. And she had contacted the attorney's office beforehand and asked whether they had any of Roland Voss's personal papers beyond what had been sent with the inheritance documentation. The paralegal she spoke with said there was a box of materials that had come with the estate and that she was welcome to collect it. The attorney's office was on the main street of Cressfield, a town that was smaller than she had imagined, the kind of town where the main street was also most of the town. The paralegal, a woman near retirement age named Helen, brought out the box without ceremony and offered her the use of a small conference room if she wanted to look through it there. She said she would take it with her if that was permitted. Helen said it was. She added, with the comfortable candor of someone who had been around the documentation of other people's lives for a long time, that Mr. Voss had been a careful man, that his affairs had been in unusual order for someone his age without immediate family, and that she hoped the inheritance had been of some use. Nora said it had been of considerable use. She drove back to Aldine County with the box on the passenger seat, through the northern terrain that Roland Voss had known professionally over the decades of his surveying career, the rough country with its complicated geological record that a man who spent his working life reading land would have known intimately. She thought about him driving this same route in some earlier spring, in the decade before she was born, knowing the land the way she had learned to know the Gentry Ravine parcel, through attention and repetition, and the specific understanding that comes from standing in a place long enough for it to stop being abstract. She opened the box that evening after Macy was asleep. It contained what she had expected, and one thing she had not. The expected things were personal papers, a small collection of certificates from his surveying career, a few photographs of work sites and colleagues, the documentation of a quiet and precise professional life. A journal of his surveying work from the 1980s, filled with the same kind of meticulous notation she imagined he had applied to everything, measurements and observations and the occasional dry comment in the margins about terrain conditions or the behavior of a particular hillside under wet weather. The unexpected thing was a letter. It was addressed to her, not to the estate, not to a next of kin in general terms, but to her specifically by name in the careful handwriting she recognized now from the deed documents. She held it for a moment before opening it. It was 3 paragraphs. The handwriting was steadier than she had expected for a man in the last years of his life, still the deliberate, unhurried script of someone who wrote as he did everything else, with full attention. He wrote that he had chosen her because of the job she held, because a woman who spent her working life in a county records office understood land in the way land needed to be understood, as a living document rather than a static asset. He wrote that the Gentry Ravine parcel had been left in his care by the terrain itself, that every survey he had ever run in the eastern county had pointed him toward that formation as something worth knowing, and that he had known it for 31 years and believed it would matter eventually and had been content to wait for eventually to arrive. He wrote that he hoped she would not be in a hurry, that the land rewarded patience in the same way that good survey work rewarded patience by revealing more the longer you stayed with it. The last sentence of the letter was brief, and she thought entirely characteristic of a man she had never known well enough, but was only now beginning to understand. He wrote, "I expect you will know what it is worth." She folded the letter along its original creases and held it in her hands for a long moment in the quiet of the new house. And with the tree in the backyard visible through the kitchen window, and the first warm night of the spring moving outside, and Macy asleep down the hall. "I expect you will know what it is worth." She had known. Not immediately, and not without effort, and not without the 18 months of attention and stubbornness, and the specific refusal to accept other people's assessments. But she had known. And the knowing had been enough. She placed the letter in the box with the rest of Roland Voss's papers and set the box on the shelf beside the ledger of Gentry Ravine tax payments and the county survey maps she had folded and kept, because some documents were worth keeping even after the thing they documented had concluded. Outside, the spring night continued over the county. Yet the eastern hills were dark against a sky still holding the last of the evening light along its western edge. Somewhere in those hills, the ravine creek was running toward the culvert at its southern end, moving through the rock channel with the same patient efficiency it had always moved with, indifferent to what had been decided about it and what was coming. The land did not know what had happened. It did not need to. That was the thing about ground. It simply was what it was, and it waited, and eventually the world arrived at the same conclusion it had always been moving toward. She turned off the kitchen light and stood for a moment in the dark of her house, listening to the ordinary sounds of a spring evening in the eastern part of Aldine County. Then she went to bed and did not lie awake, and in the morning she was there for Massy. Now the same as always, except that the arithmetic was gone and the light through the windows was clear, and the tree in the backyard was waiting in the way that good trees wait, patient and specific and entirely sure of what it was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.